Hi, Michael Towers here again with part 2 in my video series around a non-pathologizing approach to counseling. Today I want to introduce you to one of my 5 theories that I've called a formula for success, or recently I had a client sort of rename that for me and called a map of emotional life. This is something that I introduced to my clients right at the beginning of my journey with them. It helps orientate my clients to my philosophy and my approach to counseling. And so I want to share with you the same thing that I share with my clients at the beginning of our work together. So with this formula, it starts with control. And when you have control, you're going to feel safe. And when you feel safe, you're going to choose to be vulnerable. And when you choose to be vulnerable, hope is born, and then healing will happen. Now, to understand how this formula works, I have an opposite formula, which starts with you being out of control. And when you're out of control, you experience fear and anxiety. And after fear and anxiety comes something I've called forced vulnerability. And after forced vulnerability comes hopelessness and then harm. So with this formula, there are only 2 things you ever need to do. And the first one is to have control. And the second one is to choose to be vulnerable. So let's talk about vulnerability for a moment to understand the differences here. So vulnerability, as we know, is allowing ourselves to be known more than we'd normally let ourselves be known. So what's the difference between choosing to be vulnerable versus forced vulnerability? Well, the first example I'm going to use is you and me, the therapist and the client. And as we start our work together, there's these social narratives that have been constructed around what it means to be a client and so expectations of therapy. And the tongue-in-cheek example I give is like, okay, I'm seeing a therapist. I guess that means I have to tell them my deepest, darkest secret. But if you don't feel safe and you give in to those types of I should messages, then what's going to happen is that's called forced vulnerability, and that will always lead to hopelessness and to harm. So safety is critical in that therapeutic connection. But this doesn't just exist in the counseling room. This exists in all of our close relationships. And so the second example I give is a relationship with your intimate partner as an example. And in that example, there are also social constructed narratives around what it means to be, well, I'll use myself as an example, what it means to be a father or a husband. And if there's difficulties in that relationship and I'm going, well, I need to do this to be a good father, or I should do this to be a good husband, then that will lead to what I have called forced vulnerability again. And that will lead to hopelessness and to harm. So our effort needs to be on identifying those areas of our relationship that we don't feel safe in, and then work to create safety. So how do we create safety? Well, that's through control. But control it's not about how you control your circumstances or other people around you. It's all about how you show up in any given situation. And how you do that, I ask 2 questions. And the first question is, who are you? And the second question is, how do you want to be known? And when you answer these questions, no labels, only adjectives. Now, it's this point that most of my clients, as they hear this, I recognize that I've created a bit of an existential angst for them, because we normally don't go around asking ourselves these types of questions. And so there's a stumbling. They don't know how to answer it. If they're not allowed to identify their profession, or that they're a dad or a husband or something like that, then how do we describe ourselves? Now, the reason why I introduced this formula and this formula is really based on identity work and the process of becoming differentiated. And the reason why I introduced it at the very beginning is because I compare the counseling journey to being in a boat on a stormy sea. We can get tossed around and disorientated. And the differentiation work is like an anchor for that boat. And so over the years that I've been implementing this, my clients, that the sooner that they can get connected to who they are in those initial descriptions, the easier it is for them to navigate the counseling journey. And from a non-pathologizing perspective, this is critical to help empower our clients on self, to help them understand their preferred narrative, and to do that work right at the very beginning as we work on untangling themselves from their problem-saturated story or those things in their life that they find disruptive. And so there's one element of this formula that I really wanted to focus on today from a non-pathologizing perspective, and it is this idea of the differentiated self through control. And so the differentiated self I reference as an internal control mechanism, meaning we have an assurance of who we are. We experience that strength and power in our voice, and because of that differentiated self, we know how to create safety for ourselves in pretty much every situation. When we are struggling with who we are, then we use what I refer to as an external control mechanism. And I want you to hear very carefully what I'm about to say next. And I'll start with this statement and then unpack it a bit for you. The example that I use of an external control mechanism is lying, manipulation, dissociation. And I use those three words because they are often pathologized, especially in our profession. That if someone is showing up and they're lying or they're manipulating, we deem it moralistically as wrong, harmful. But instead, I'm inviting the therapist and I'm inviting you, the client, to take a different look at this and recognize that these types of external control mechanisms that we use, and they could pretty much be anything. Think of loud or strong emotions that show up. Think of stepping away from social situations. Think it could pretty much be anything that we do. And we're doing these things in order to give ourselves a measure of control so we can feel safe. Now, from a systems perspective, let me unpack it a bit more. So every relationship that we have, say with your partner, that would be one system. Say at work, that's another system. And say with your friends, that's another system, and et cetera, et cetera. And so from a systems perspective, we are striving to find a sense of belonging and connection in each of those systems. And in order to do that, we need to feel safe. And so what we'll do is we will implement a variety of mechanisms in order to facilitate that safety. So take a look at your behaviors and how you are at work and how you are with your friends and how you are with your family. And you'll begin to recognize those mechanisms that you have put in place that help create safety for yourself. And this is something to be celebrated, not to be moralized and not to be pathologized in any way. And so that's why I use the examples of lying, manipulation, and dissociation. Because what happens when we explore the narratives around this is that we take the person who's lying as an example, and they have obviously lied in the past successfully in order to create a sense of control so they can feel safe. Now, what normally happens is when I see the clients in my counseling room is that lying has become disruptive, meaning the system that they are connected to is calling them out on their lying. They're troubled by the lying. And so from a place of disruption, the client shows up going, hey, I've been lying and it's kept me safe all this time. I'm doing the translation here. And now I don't know what to do. I don't have any other tools in my toolbox. And so what we've done, if I can untangle the client from this idea of lying and recognize it as an external control mechanism, I'm no longer pathologizing the client. It's simply a mechanism that they've used over the years, ultimately to keep them safe. And because I work on the presupposition that we all are striving to find safety in every system that we belong to, there's no need to moralize this. There's no need to pathologize it. It's only meant to understand how that mechanism has worked for the client. And if the client doesn't have any other mechanisms to draw on, together we can find some other mechanisms that will help them feel safe in those variety of systems. So ultimately, the goal here, the differentiation goal, is that we will have a strong sense of self, and our 100% authenticity will then show up in every single system that we belong to. To illustrate this, we often talk about this idea, this is how I am at home, this is how I am at work, and this is how I am with my friends. And we talk about these different states of being in each of these systems, but that process of living and navigating life in of itself can create an existential angst. And so the idea here is to learn who we are and how we want to be known, to arrive in this differentiated state so we can be 100% authentic in every system that we belong to. And then the only thing left is that we decide how much of ourselves we're going to make known in each of those systems that we belong to. This ultimately is the best way from that internal control mechanism in order to give ourselves a measure of control so we feel safe. But in the meantime, feel free to use any other type of external control mechanism you have, because what you're actually doing is creating control and creating safety for yourself. This is something that I want to celebrate with you, and I want to work with you, and so I'm inviting you to think about these ideas in a different way. Thanks for your time.